So does the financial industry need more or less regulation? Joining me to discuss this is Graciela Chichilnisky, Professor of Economics and Statistics at Columbia University. Thanks for joining us. So let's focus with what Donald Trump has said. And he has said that he would repeal Dodd-Frank, that it has choked off the banking sector. He's blamed it for the anemic recovery, saying, and I quote, "The regulatory climate is so bad that the banks just aren't loaning to businesses. And that is one of the reasons you have GDP. It's one of the reasons we have no growth." So do you think that the Dodd-Frank and the regulations that it brings and imposed on the banks are choking off lending and hampering business growth, and that it has indeed crippled the financial sector?
Not quite. I think it is important to have a regulatory environment that is sustainable for business. And to have crisis is not sustainable, and it doesn't encourage business. So anything that can encourage sustainability is good for business.
Okay, but given that these regulations are now in place, and many are saying that they have restricted the banks from doing their primary job, which is to lend, and that is hampering growth, do you think they should be lifted?
No, I think the whole regulatory environment should be structured to help business activity, and I think we need to change certain measure parameters. For example, we need to give more importance to small events, small probability events that are considered too rare but do matter and lead to crisis. We definitely have to look at leveraging that can get out of control, and the financial instruments that can do that. And all of that doesn't have to be regulation, but it has to be an environmental structure for the banks and for the financial institutions that are supportive of business.
So, Graciela, what would easing the Dodd-Frank regulations actually translate into? What impact would that have?
I'm sorry?
What if we did ease the Dodd-Frank regulations or repeal them, as Donald Trump has suggested, what impact do you think that would have on the economy and the financial sector?
Oh, I don't think it would be a good idea to repeal that regulation right now. But I do think that you need to create a more conducive climate to support business. And that regulation doesn't really do that.
Right. Well, joining us to give us his opinion, better late than never, is John Allison, the CEO of Unio Capital. John, good to have you.
Good to have you.
So, John, as we're discussing Donald Trump saying he would repeal Dodd-Frank, that it has choked off the banking sector. Agree or disagree?
First of all, I don't think there's any chance of his repealing it. So let's just dealing with reality. Secondly, I think that Dodd-Frank, like all these giant pieces of legislation that occur after a financial crisis or any crisis, are highly imperfect. So I think what the reality is that Dodd-Frank will be tweaked. That's the reality.
You do think it would be tweaked? Well, how so? What kind of tweaks could we expect?
I think lobbyists will go in there, whether it's Hillary Clinton or whether it's Donald Trump, and they will try to get little advantages here and there. But the broad regulatory impact of Dodd-Frank, I think, is here to stay. And part of the reason I think that is I think that with the great respect to our wonderful politicians, I think banking reform is yesterday's news. I think people are far more concerned about growth. They're assuming that doing something to regulatory reform of banks is going to help growth, but I don't think that's really the big deal.
You don't think that lifting regulations would prompt more lending and more growth in the financial sector and beyond?
I don't think it's the lifting of regulations. I think it's the simplifying of regulations. I think it is, and I think Graciela agrees with that.
Right.
It's a jungle of regulations. We need to actually cut away the jungle.
Well, Clinton is saying she wants to make that jungle even thicker and even bigger. At least that's what she's saying publicly. She's calling for extending Dodd-Frank. She said, as president, I would not only veto any legislation that would weaken financial reform, but I would also fight for tough new rules, stronger enforcement, and more accountability that go well beyond Dodd-Frank. Now, keeping in mind that privately, during some speeches that she gave to Goldman Sachs obtained by WikiLeaks, she has made a very different position, saying that she is far more Wall Street friendly, and that the jury is still out on Dodd-Frank, and that it does suppress lending. But assuming Clinton does come into office and does extend the Dodd-Frank Act, what do you expect there?
I expect that there will be a tweaking, precisely as you said, but in addition, that
But a tweaking to make it stronger or to make it more less regulatory?
It's not a question of more or less. It's a question of finding the right type of parameters that are conducive for business. Everybody needs growth. Everybody wants growth, and the financial sector is there to promote growth. But the regulation that we have is there because we don't want people to take risks without knowing that they are taking them, and that causes problems for the economy as a whole. We don't want people to be exposed, and therefore we have some regulation to try to help. But this is never a perfect solution. You are going to have tweaking. You need also to consider longer term, decrease the discount of the future so that you have more consideration for long-term growth. And if we go against long-term growth, we will have lower growth. And that's what's happening now. And that is the type of regulation that is not considered right now and should be perhaps taken into consideration. It's not really regulation. It's a different environment that is more conducive to long-term investment, infrastructure, and business.
Well, John, the idea behind Dodd-Frank, the argument is that it's there to protect consumers and to minimize risk and to prevent a possible too big to fail repeat. Do you agree with that argument?
I think that's the reason it's there. I think, just actually, if I may just go back to your Hillary Clinton thing, if I were a fly on the wall of Hillary Clinton's brain, which is an unlikely event, but were I to that, there's what Hillary Clinton says,
right,
what Hillary can do and what she will do. I think what Hillary Clinton really means, and maybe even what Trump means, is I want an umpire that's strong, i.e. a regulatory system that's strong. I want to tweak the rules so that they're a little stronger, and I want to make sure that the rules are called out. I don't think this is anywhere near as radical as what people are saying they are.
But assuming she does stick to what she says, and we all know that campaign promises and what translates after the election can be very different things, but she's gone beyond that. She says she wants to levy a risk fee on the largest banks beyond the higher capital requirements that were imposed 6 years ago. She wants to tighten the Volcker rule. She wants to tax certain types of high-frequency trading. She's also proposed to revamp capital gains taxes. Do you support this in any way, shape, or form?
The only thing I would support is revamping capital gains taxes to emphasize actually giving benefits to people who hold securities for longer periods of time. That's as a personal support. But I think with Hillary Clinton and her risk fee, I don't think it's going to happen. The reason I don't is the banks are choked with all sorts of costs. I don't think they'll be able to swallow this cost. I think the business of high-frequency trading is like trying to regulate electric power lines. High power lines, more electricity goes to the lines, we're gonna tax them for it. It's very, very difficult to do. I think the Volcker rule, if you work for a bank, which I do not, but I know people who do, the Volcker rule is already in place. So I think those things they make for good sound bites. I just don't think they're going to happen. I think whether Trump or Clinton revamps capital gains, I think could be beneficial if they do it right.
All right.
I agree.
We're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you so much, John Allison, the CEO of Unio Capital, and Graciela Chichilnisky, Professor of Economics and Statistics at Columbia University.